Hello there, and welcome to this quiet exploration of the past. Tonight, we're stepping into the seemingly eternal world of ancient Egypt, a land of desert winds, golden sands, and a great river that carried the heartbeat of a civilization for over 3,000 years. It is a story you may think you know. Pyramids rising toward the sky, mummies wrapped in linen, temples towering over the Nile. But underneath the monuments and treasures, the pharaohs lived lives that were far more disturbing, demanding and heavy than the surface grandeur suggests. They were revered as gods on earth, but beneath that godhood were people bound by rituals, restrictions, and customs that often weighed as much as the stones of the pyramids themselves. Picture the Nile at dawn. The first rays of sunlight catch on the ripples of the water, gilding the surface with a brilliance that seems eternal. On either side stretch fertile fields, lush green against the ochre of the desert. This river ran like a life vein through one of the most remarkable civilizations known to history. It was here that a complex kingdom arose around 3100 BCE when the first pharaoh united Upper and Lower Egypt into one. The crown he wore, a combination of the tall white crown of Upper Egypt and the low red crown of Lower Egypt, was more than just decoration. It was a living symbol, a reminder that all life depended on his ability to balance the two lands. To his people, the pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was a divine being, the very embodiment of Horus, the falcon god who ruled the sky. This divinity was both a blessing and a curse. To be living as a god meant extraordinary power. The pharaoh's word was law, his judgment final, his presence the rallying force behind armies, temples, and monumental construction projects. And yet it also meant he had to bear the unspeakable weight of sustaining Ma'at, the cosmic order of balance, justice, and harmony. Everything in Egypt, from the flooding of the Nile to the prosperity of the crops, was tied in people's minds to the pharaoh's ability to keep Ma'at intact. If he faltered, the entire universe could fall into chaos. Imagine waking each morning with the belief that your personal conduct determined whether the sun would rise again tomorrow. This was no ordinary life. The pharaoh's day began before sunrise, when priests and servants attended to his purification rituals. He was cleansed with sacred water, his body smoothed with oils, his head and limbs shaved clean to symbolize purity and to keep parasites at bay. Cosmetics were not trivial vanities, but necessities of kingship. His eyes were lined with black coal that not only enhanced his divine appearance, but also protected them against the relentless desert glare and infections borne by dust. Perfumes were applied in generous layers, their fragrant smoke thought to please the gods and repel any mischievous spirits lurking in shadows. Once the body had been made sacred and the regalia placed piece by piece, the necklaces that glimmered in the light, the crook that stood for protection, the flail that symbolized punishment, the pharaoh was prepared to emerge. Imagine the awe when he stepped into open courtyards, gleaming with gold and ivory. People didn't see another man. They saw a god striding forth, radiating the authority of heaven on earth. It was theater on a divine scale, but it had consequences. Every step that followed, every decision, every movement, had to align with the cosmic order. Eat with the wrong hand, step into a shrine with the wrong foot, let your shadow cross over a sacred figure, and disaster might befall your realm. Of course, in reality, the sun would still rise, the Nile would still flow. But for Egyptians of the time, these lapses absolutely threatened existence itself. The rituals of devotion filled his mornings. In dim sanctuaries heavy with incense, the pharaoh performed rites for gods such as Ra, Osiris, Amun, and Hathor. Temple walls carved with his likeness showed him endlessly making offerings, as though he never paused for rest. These offerings of bread, wine, incense, or gold were more than symbolic gestures. They were thought to feed the gods and energize them, ensuring that in return, the blessings of life, fertility, and good harvests would fall upon Egypt. In quieter terms, we might say the pharaoh spent much of his day negotiating with the divine world on behalf of his people, a go-between who could never afford absence. The idea of boredom or sleep was unthinkable. Every chant, every drop of wine poured, and every syllable uttered was a performance of cosmic maintenance. To stumble in performance was to endanger millions. After the ceremonies, the pharaoh entered into his role as judge and ruler. In council, he sat upon thrones plated with gold leaf, inlaid with semi-precious stones. But don't be dazzled by the sparkle. What surrounded him was a bureaucracy as complex as any modern government. The vizier, his most trusted official, recited lists of disputes and tasks. Boundary disagreements between farmers, reports of grain storage, struggles over irrigation, complaints against corrupt officials, and treaties needing approval. The pharaoh could consult, but in the end, no assembly, no parliament, no rival authority limited him. His decision was absolute, yet behind that absolute power lurked constant paranoia. Each decree had to be carefully balanced, so as not to upset powerful priests, landowners, or generals, any of whom could whisper discontent that might blossom into rebellion. The palace was not merely a glittering hall, but a nest of vipers. Family members schemed in secret, advisors plotted gain, and devotion could turn into betrayal in the time it takes for ink to dry on papyrus. Amid this endless tide of demands, the pharaoh was expected to embody vitality. Festivals saw him parading through the streets in spectacular processions aboard chariots glinting in the sun. Priests chanted, trumpets blared, and ordinary people threw themselves prostrate, afraid even to lift their eyes. On these occasions, he was not only affirming his kingship, but also strengthening the cosmic order by publicly uniting the people under his divine aura. Yet these moments of grand spectacle demanded immense resource. The cost in food, labor, and time for one lavish festival could drain thousands of households. Still, no one dared question it, for all of Egypt's stability, at least in belief, depended on it. But the life of the pharaoh, though gilded, was shadowed by superstition. Consider how he ate, never casually, never without the thought that spirits might meddle with his health. Tasting food was entrusted first to others, for poison was always a real danger. He dined upon duck, beef, figs, honey and bread, served with wine and beer, while common laborers survived on onions and barley. Even these feasts came under divine scrutiny. An indulgence misplaced might offend gods who preferred moderation, while failure to display lavish abundance could be interpreted as ingratitude enough to call down famine. So, every meal became yet another balancing act between cosmic favor and personal desire. One might imagine that such a dazzling position left room for rest, yet even in leisure, the pharaoh's duties never truly ended. Games like Senet were not simply diversions, but symbolic contests representing the soul's passage into the afterlife, each move a gesture tied to destiny itself. Hunting was not only entertainment, but ritual. When the pharaoh loosed arrows at lions or antelope from his chariot, it was staged as an embodiment of triumph over chaos, proof that he could overcome the disorder that threatened Egypt. Even in tender family settings, with wives, with children, with musicians playing delicate harps, the weight of divinity hovered over him. He was not merely a husband or father. His relationships were stitched into political strategy and myth, every union tied to both lineage and the sacred blood of gods. Through it all, a truth lingered. For every brick placed in a pyramid, every festival celebrated, and every ode incised in stone, death loomed close, casting its long shadow. The pharaoh lived surrounded by memento mori, reminders that this earthly life, however powerful, was only a temporary preparation for eternity. The looming question haunted him. Would his careful rituals, the sacrifices made, and the treasures stockpiled be enough to grant him safe passage into the next life? That anxiety seeped into every action. Even sleep was never just sleep. In dreams, gods were thought to speak, offering omens about the pharaoh's conduct. He could rise at dawn shaken, convinced that disaster loomed if he did not order an immediate sacrifice or commission a new temple. When we look at ancient Egypt's monuments, it's easy to see them as cold stone. But behind their construction were human lives spent in service of a single person's quest for immortality. Thousands labored under the desert sun, day after day, cutting, dragging, and lifting stones so massive that even with modern machinery, they would challenge us. These workers, many drawn from peasant families in times when fields lay flooded, endured breaking backs, broken bones, and the constant threat of death. To them, the pharaoh was indeed a god, but one whose appetite for eternity consumed the living. It is one of the disturbing truths of this great civilization. The immortality of the few was built quite literally on the toil and pain of the many. And so, the image of the pharaoh crystallizes for us, both magnificent and unsettling. A ruler in shimmering robes scented with incense, carrying the flail and crook, standing as a bridge between mortals and gods, while simultaneously trapped in a gilded cage of superstition and fear. His life was devoted to rituals that sustained an entire world in the minds of his people. His days were a cycle of purification, offerings, judgment, spectacle, paranoia, and ceaseless reminders of death. Though immortal in belief, he was as fragile as any human, clinging to power in a world where the failure of a single ritual could mean ruin. And in this haunting blend of grandeur and burden, of devotion and dread, we catch our first glimpse into the disturbing life of pharaohs in ancient Egypt. As dawn broke over the Nile Valley, the pharaoh's day carried forward as though written in scripture long before he drew breath. He moved from the sanctity of his morning rituals into the heart of government, where walls carved with eternal scenes of triumph surrounded chambers thick with the murmurs of scribes and advisors. The vizier, his closest administrative arm, unspooled lists of petitions. Farmers disputing boundaries where the river's annual flood had shifted markers. Merchants asking permission to trade with lands beyond the desert and sea. Generals reporting on unrest near Egypt's borders. With absolute authority, the pharaoh was expected to weigh each case not only with political acumen, but also under the ever-watchful eyes of the gods. A decision wasn't merely practical, it was sacred. Justice, known as mat, was not just law, but cosmic order. To tip a scale unfairly was not only an error of leadership, but a cosmic misstep, threatening balance across the whole universe, at least as Egyptians believed. The weight of this responsibility often concealed just how precarious the pharaoh's position was, despite his divine status. Inside the court, voices whispered. Siblings, half-siblings, and consorts plotted behind silken curtains, eager to push their own children forward as heirs for the throne. Alliances were forged in shadows, promises sealed with secret oaths, and betrayal lingered as naturally as the ever-present desert dust. The pharaoh, while revered as a god, often stood as the loneliest man in Egypt, surrounded by countless attendants, yet mistrustful of nearly everyone who called him kin. Royal households became crucibles of jealousy and competition, where a gentle smile at a banquet could mask the sharp edge of a dagger waiting in the dark. Consider the pharaoh's great royal wives. The chief queen often originated from the royal family itself, sometimes even a sister or half-sister. These marriages, strange to our modern sensibilities, were a deliberate strategy to preserve the divine bloodline and mimic the gods themselves, like Isis and Osiris, who were both siblings and spouses. Yet the sacred intent only sharpened the rivalries within the women's quarters. A royal harem was more political arena than sanctuary. Each wife, each concubine, each foreign princess brought as tribute carried hopes of placing her children closer to the throne. These women wielded influence not merely with beauty or charm, but with alliances, bribes, and strategies so refined that even seasoned generals might envy their cunning. The palace was a glittering hive where affection, loyalty, and conspiracy all intertwined. History tells us of queens like Hatshepsut, who rose beyond her station as consort and grasped the throne itself. Once only a caretaker regent for her stepson, she asserted full kingship, donning false beards in statues and ordering her artisans to depict her as male in official inscriptions. Her reign of over 2 decades showed not only the possibility of female authority in Egypt, but also the fragility of succession. Her story reveals how quickly the balance of divine kingship could shift, and how the pharaoh's supposed divinity did not always guarantee stability. The same throne thought to be eternal was in truth constantly pulled at by ambitious hands. Other stories sink deeper into the disturbing shadows. In the Amarna period, Akhenaten discarded centuries of tradition by declaring the sun disk, Aten, to be the sole god. He closed temples, alienated powerful priesthoods, and moved the capital to a new city built in his deity's name. Within palace walls, he lived in extraordinary intimacy with his family, commissioning scenes of himself and his queen Nefertiti in tender domestic embraces that broke with centuries of formality. Yet whispers of incest circulate around the memory of his reign, with evidence suggesting unions even with daughters to maintain divine clarity in the bloodline. This turn toward exclusivity sharpened the sense of unease and instability Egypt endured under his rule. When he died, the kingdom was left fractured and vulnerable, the carefully tended balance of Maat disrupted by religious zeal and personal obsession. Though Akhenaten was extreme, he was not singular. Royal marriages often ignored the boundaries of kinship in an attempt to preserve sanctity of rule. The genetic price was steep. Medical examinations of mummies have revealed deformities and illnesses consistent with years of inbreeding. King Tutankhamun, perhaps the most famous pharaoh today because of the treasures uncovered in his tomb, lived a short and painful life, marked by bone deformities and disease. His iconic golden mask dazzles the eyes, But inside lay the frail remains of a boy king overwhelmed not only by early death, but by the weight of generations of genetic burden born of divine obsession. Yet, for all the twisted realities of palace life, the pharaoh's public image always had to shine immaculate. Festivals reinforced his divinity. The Opet festival in Thebes, for example, saw immense processional barges drifting down the Nile, carrying the statues of gods accompanied by the pharaoh himself. Chants echoed, offerings were bestowed, and commoners filled the riverbanks to catch a glimpse of their ruler radiant beneath the sun's blaze. To them, every ritual reaffirmed that their divine king upheld Mut and safeguarded Egypt's prosperity. Even when the royal household seethed behind the walls, the spectacle outside declared only harmony. Power, however, was never without cost. Royal building projects, often the most visible assertion of authority, demanded staggering sacrifices from the people. The pyramids, though built centuries before many of the later pharaohs we know, embody this burden. Imagine thousands of workers straining beneath blocks weighing several tons, dragging them across the desert under the punishing sun, day after day, season after season. While popular imagination once cast these workers as slaves, archaeological evidence suggests they were more often farmers employed during flood seasons when their fields lay submerged. Yet the conditions were punishing. Their bones later found to bear the marks of crushed spines, arthritis, and deep exhaustion. They did not carve their names into eternity. Their labor was anonymous, folded into the silent mass that propped one man's pursuit of an eternal afterlife. In some of the earliest dynasties, the pharaoh's pursuit of eternity extended into practices even grimmer. Human sacrifice, known as retainer sacrifice, marked the burials of early kings. Servants, guards, and even pets were killed and interred alongside their king, believed necessary to continue service beyond the mortal world. At Abydos, archaeologists uncovered rows of subsidiary graves surrounding royal tombs, silent testimonies to a belief system in which the pharaoh's comfort outweighed human life. Men and women alike, perhaps honored, perhaps terrified, were taken to their deaths upon their god-king's burial. With time, the practice faded, replaced by symbolic figures called shabti, meant to magically perform labor in the afterlife. But the chilling truth remains. At least for a time, loyalty to a pharaoh was paid in flesh. Thus, the life of the pharaoh reveals itself not simply as gilded luxury, but as a paradox. A cage lined with gold and guarded by rigid rituals, dangerous rivalries and relentless demands. He was regarded as divine, yet remained all too human. He lived as a god in ritual, but endured betrayal as a man. His image across temple walls showed him eternally youthful and triumphant, smiting enemies, blessing the people, and communing with the gods. But behind those walls were decisions born of anxiety, marriages warped by superstition, and the ever-present weight that his death meant more than mortality. It was a transition that had to be managed with an unimaginable arsenal of rituals, protections and provisions to stave chaos at bay. Even as the night's silence settled across Egypt and the stars rose in the clear darkness, the pharaoh's burdens never ceased. Dreams were thought to be doorways through which gods delivered cryptic warnings or blessings. A troubling vision could send the entire palace staff into action by morning, rushing to fulfill new sacrifices or build shrines to appease unseen threats. Sleep was not rest, but another stage of dialogue with a universe perpetually demanding balance. In this way, from sunrise to the fading embers of the evening, the existence of a pharaoh unfolded as relentless ritual on a colossal stage, a life disturbingly shaped by both unimaginable privilege and suffocating pressure. And so we continue to drift deeper into the shadows behind the shimmering mask of pharaonic Egypt, where the divine and the human were bound together by superstition, ceremony, ambition, and fear. The deeper we move into the pharaoh's world, the clearer it becomes that his existence was both magnificent and suffocating. Every sunrise brought with it not only light, but the relentless turning of a wheel of duties that kept his life tethered to the rhythm of gods, rituals, and political survival. While the public saw only glory, in private the pharaoh endured a world where family ties were as treacherous as the shifting sands, and where even a dream might stir suspicion, signaling an omen demanding action. To be pharaoh was to live in perpetual theatre, to never step off stage. Not even for a breath. The palace itself was a reflection of this duality, a place beautified with columns painted in vibrant colours, ceilings patterned with stars, and walls adorned with scenes of festivals and victories. Fragrant gardens surrounded courtyards, fountains splashed, and exotic animals dozed in shades of sycamore secured by handlers. Yet behind this beauty, the atmosphere was rarely tranquil. Servants moved nervously, courtiers whispered, and advisors measured every word lest they misstep and pay dearly. The great royal wife might linger in gilded chambers, but always at the edges loomed the inevitability of rivalry. Each royal child was a potential heir, each consort's son a potential threat. The pharaoh, meanwhile, was caught in a cycle of both blessing and curse, unable to cherish private family life because every hug, every son, every daughter was woven into the brutal calculations of succession. Succession was never simple. Primogeniture, the automatic inheritance by the eldest son, was not a consistent rule in Egypt. Rather, the throne could pass to a younger son if his mother wielded more influence, or even to a daughter in extraordinary cases. This ambiguity created a constant simmering tension. Heirs jockeyed for position, drawing lines of loyalty among priests, generals, and nobles. A son overlooked might turn conspirator, hiding daggers beneath ceremonial robes. A courtier out of favor might whisper poison into the ear of a queen. And soon the palace was awash in undercurrents of treachery. History preserved one chilling episode from the reign of Ramses III. His household was enormous, his reign long, and his wives many, each one nurturing hopes of the throne for her own offspring. Rivalries festered until a conspiracy unfolded, led by a secondary wife named T who sought to enthrone her son. The plot grew vast, involving scribes, officers, and even servants within the palace. When it was uncovered, a grim tableau followed. The conspirators were forced to their deaths, some executed, some compelled to take their own lives. Archaeological evidence shows Ramses himself was mortally wounded in the ordeal, his throat slit by assassins who had nearly succeeded. Even the most powerful pharaohs lived beneath the constant threat of their own household. And when conspirators failed, punishment was merciless, broadcast across Egypt to remind everyone what defiance of God and king would bring. But the dangers surrounding the pharaoh stretched far beyond family. Egypt's wealth inevitably attracted the envious gaze of its neighbors. Nubians to the south, Libyans to the west, Hittites and Mitanni to the north, all tested Egypt's borders through the centuries. Thus, the pharaoh also bore the eternal burden of war. Though generals conducted much of the strategy, the pharaoh was depicted as warrior incarnate, trampling enemies beneath his chariot wheels. Temples portrayed him larger than life, drawing his bow against foreign hordes, their smaller figures groveling at his might. These images were not simple propaganda. They reassured the people that chaos was ever held at bay by the God-King. Yet behind the stone reliefs, real battles left scars, lives lost, wealth drained, alliances made and broken. The pharaoh may have appeared invincible, but defeat was always possible. And to acknowledge such defeat risked damaging the sacred aura that linked him to Ma'at. When not standing at the helm of armies or councils, the pharaoh retreated into ritual again and again. His personal devotion was not private in the modern sense. At the heart of temples, hidden within sanctuaries where only priests and king could enter, statues of the gods awaited. There in dim light, the pharaoh performed offerings of food, wine, incense, and precious metals. He didn't commune aloud as one might in prayer, but enacted a strict liturgy crafted over centuries. Without such repeated offerings, Egyptians believed the gods would weaken, their favor diminished, and the forces of disorder slip into Egypt. Each ritual was a negotiation with eternity itself, a reinforcement of his cosmic role. Yet while gods received steady devotion, human appetites pressed on. Banquets filled the night hours in fragrant halls where courtiers reclined on cushions, as musicians plucked lyres and dancers painted in gold performed. The pharaoh sat at the center, golden goblet in hand, savoring honey cakes, beef, duck, and sweet wine, while entertainers circled. Yet, even in these moments, he remained tethered to performance. His presence at banquets was itself a declaration of abundance, prosperity, and the blessings of the gods. To fail to display abundance was as dangerous as appearing indulgent. The pharaoh had to embody satisfaction, but never gluttony, wealth, but never arrogance, strength, but never weakness. In every arena of life, balance was demanded, an exhausting exhaustion only the gods could be expected to endure. But here, it was borne by a man. It was within these same lavish halls that darker whispers grew. Wine loosened tongues, music softened ears, and plots might blossom A glance exchanged between courtiers or a beckoning gesture from a queen might carry greater consequence than any pyramid stone set in place. Loyalty in the palace, if it existed at all, was fragile, always tested by ambition. Even those closest to the pharaoh, his viziers, guards, and even physicians, were not above suspicion. Poisoning was a terror not relegated to legend alone. Food and drink were often tested before reaching the king's lips. Trusted tasters risked their lives daily, for the line between friend and traitor was indistinguishable. While most of Egypt saw the pharaoh as divine protector, the darker reality was that he lived besieged by the very grandeur that enthralled his people. His crown may have shimmered in the desert sun, but it pressed heavy with paranoia. For every temple built, there was a conspiracy brewing. For every monument raised, there was fatigue and injury among workers. For every hymn sung in his honor, silence masked shadows whispering his downfall. Still, despite these darker truths, the pharaoh endured as the axis around which Egyptian life revolved. In festivals that stretched day and night, he renewed the people's faith that all remained in order. Priests carried statues of gods, incense clouded the air, offerings piled high in rituals grand enough to dazzle even the skeptical. Torchlit ceremonies drew multitudes to witness the spectacle, and in the pharaoh's face, painted with divine beauty, glowing under gold, they saw continuity with heaven itself. To doubt was unthinkable, for to doubt the pharaoh was to the universe. Order depended upon his existence. Chaos waited at the edge of every shadow. This was the paradox. The god-king carried the burden of sustaining eternity, while behind palace walls, mortality pressed closer with each passing day. And so, as another evening settled over the timeless Nile, the pharaoh once again faced his greatest preoccupation: death. His rule, however glorious, was finite. His flesh, however pampered, would fail. Every breath was a reminder not of eternity gained, but of time slipping away. Thus, even at the height of his power, his mind turned endlessly to tombs, temples, and treasures, works not simply of vanity, but of desperate preparation. For all his divine titles, in the end he remained human, and death was unavoidable. That stark truth loomed larger than any enemy and more disturbing than any rival. And in that truth lay the pharaoh's most enduring obsession: how to turn the brief flicker of life into the endless glow of eternity. As the stars rose high over the desert sky and the torches within the palace flickered against gilded walls, the pharaoh's thoughts inevitably bent toward the one certainty that bound him tightly. As surely as linen wrappings would one day bind his body: death. To the Egyptians, life was not an ending, but a transition, a stepping stone toward an afterlife that mirrored and yet surpassed the earthly world. For the pharaoh, this transition demanded astonishing preparation, for his eternal fate was not about his soul alone, but the continued equilibrium of Egypt itself. His journey into death had to be perfect, without flaw, bolstered with all the wealth, rituals, and magic that could be summoned. Every pharaoh began to prepare for eternity almost immediately upon ascending the throne. It might be the first, or at least the most important project of his reign: his tomb. These were not casual burial places, but elaborate cities of the dead. In earlier dynasties, massive pyramids rose against the horizon, glittering temples of stone meant to ascend the king's soul to the heavens. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, still towering today above the Giza Plateau, was more than a grand tomb. It was a monument to obsession. Over 2 million blocks of limestone and granite, some weighing as much as several tons, were hauled, cut, and fitted with a precision that continues to astonish. In the hot sun, under the lash of overseers, thousands of laborers strained for decades so that one man might have a stairway to the stars. Later, kings abandoned such conspicuous pyramids, withdrawing instead to hidden burials in the Valley of the Kings. Here, deep shafts were hewn within the cliffs, corridors coiling through rock, and branching into rooms resplendent with painted ceilings, golden shrines, and protective texts. Walls blazed with images of journeys through the underworld, depicting gods and demons that waited to challenge or guide the pharaoh's spirit on his passage. These texts, the so-called Amduat and Book of the Dead, were not mere decorations. They were literal maps through eternity, spells and instructions for the soul to survive trial after trial, monstrous serpents to fight, gates to pass, hearts to be weighed against feathers of truth. But a pharaoh did not venture alone. He filled his tomb with everything from food and wine to clothing, cosmetics, games, weapons, chariots, and furniture carved from cedar and inlaid with ivory. Objects essential to daily life were recreated in the finest detail and multiplied many times over. And then came the Shapti, small figurines of servants carved of wood, stone, or faience, hundreds of them, each inscribed with magical texts. These tiny effigies were expected to come alive in the afterlife, doing menial tasks for their master, a magical replacement for the human sacrifices once demanded in earlier eras. Even so, some kings continued to take beloved animals with them into their eternal sleep. Dogs, cats, baboons, and even lions were mummified and placed alongside the king to guard or comfort him forever. The process of mummification itself was as elaborate as any temple ritual. After death, the pharaoh's body would be carried to the embalmers, where it was carefully purified. Organs were removed, the liver, stomach, lungs, intestines, dried, wrapped, and placed into canopic jars watched over by 4 protective deities, each with animal or human heads. The heart, seat of thought and soul, was usually preserved within the body, for it would be weighed by Osiris in judgment. The brain, curiously, was discarded or drawn out through the nose by delicate hooks, considered unnecessary for the afterlife. Once drained of moisture through weeks in natron, the body was anointed with fragrant oils and carefully wrapped in endless linen strips, layer upon layer, each one accompanied by amulets, spells, and charms to ward off misfortune. Golden masks covered the face, not only to preserve semblance, but to project divine brilliance so that the king entered the next world as a god, unaltered by decay. Yet for all these meticulous precautions, the fear of tomb robbers never left the pharaohs. Treasures piled so high inevitably tempted the living, and history has shown that few royal tombs escaped violation. Desperate to confuse potential looters, some kings ordered false passages, hidden seals, or curses inscribed across their tomb walls. Still, such warnings rarely deterred the hungry or greedy. Even Ramses the Great, who ruled for over 6 decades with unparalleled splendor, found his body moved again and again across secret caches as priests attempted to secure his remains when thieves broke open his original resting place. The irony is inescapable. Kings who spent a lifetime securing eternity often ended as little more than bones, shuffled secretly and forgotten in the fight against theft, the cultural weight of the pharaoh's afterlife. Preparations cannot be understated. Immense resources were drained from Egypt's economy to fund colossal tombs and mortuary temples. Entire towns of artisans and builders existed solely to labor on these eternal houses of the dead. The valley resounded with the echoes of chisels, torches smoked in underground corridors, and painters decorated chambers with pigments still vivid thousands of years later. For the common laborers, these projects were grueling necessities, but for the king, they were matters of existential urgency. His tomb was his resurrection machine. Without it, his soul would fade into nothing, leaving Mut broken and Egypt vulnerable. This singular obsession made the life of the pharaoh more haunting than enviable. He commanded armies, treasures, and monuments, yet he lived with death ever in his shadow. The more golden the walls of his chambers, the louder mortality seemed to whisper through them. Even achievements meant to proclaim eternity often broadcast desperation. Consider King Tutankhamun, his reign short, his tomb relatively modest compared to others. Yet it still contained over 5,000 items of staggering beauty, from golden shrines to daggers made from meteorite iron, all for a boy who lived scarcely 2 decades. Imagine the pressure he must have felt, born frail, plagued by disease, likely assisted in every step, and told since infancy that eternity depended on him, even as his body slowly betrayed him. His mask is the most famous icon of ancient Egypt today, but behind it lay a sickly young man, crushed by expectations as heavy as the gold around his corpse. And beyond such treasures, darker traditions remain etched into early dynasties. The human sacrifices at Abydos, where hundreds of retainers joined their king in death. Their rows of graves are mute testimony to the merciless extension of power beyond life. Although the practice faded, replaced by symbolic substitutes, its memory lingers like a grim echo of what eternity once demanded. The pharaoh's life, therefore, was caught between dazzling splendor and unsettling truth. He lived like a god, but every pleasure, every procession, every decision circled back to mortality and the desperate need to defeat it. His body was pampered, perfumed, and adorned not for the joys of life, but in practice for his eventual embalming. His festivals echoed both celebration and preparation for his role as eternal mediator. His court bustled not only with politics of the day, but also calculations of death and deity. To be pharaoh was to walk forever on a tightrope, poised above chaos while knowing that death waited patiently at the rope's end. So as the night deepened over Egypt and the whispering winds blew through temples and tomb entrances, the pharaoh lay in his bedchamber surrounded by protective amulets and guards, his body at rest, but his mind drifting through anxious dreams. Even here, amidst perfumes and silks, he could not escape the spectre of eternity. His last thought, night after night, must often have been the same. What more could he build? What more could he gather? So his name would not be swallowed by silence, and his soul might stride forever among the stars. This unrelenting obsession with death and immortality was as much a part of his life as the golden crowns upon his head. And so, the disturbing truth surfaces again. Though they ruled as gods, the pharaohs lived every day in the long, looming shadow of their own mortality. As the story of the pharaohs winds toward its end, we find ourselves suspended between admiration and unease. The grandeur of this ancient world dazzles our imagination, but beneath it, we hear the echoes of an existence that was far from restful. To be pharaoh was to live for immortality, but to bear a life entangled in obligations so heavy that there was no escape, not even in dreams. Their story is both triumph and caution, a lesson in the beautiful and the brutal intertwined. By the time the new kingdom shifted into decline, Egypt was no longer the unassailable power it once had been. Foreigners pressed at its borders, and priests and generals fought for influence inside the country. Pharaohs who once strode with supreme confidence through temples now moved more cautiously, aware that their power was vulnerable not only to mortal enemies, but also to the passage of time. And yet, they still clung to the same obsessions. Each successive ruler hoped to build higher, dig deeper, or etch his likeness larger into the walls of eternity. As if enough stone or gold could outpace decay, some of the most ambitious of them all, like Ramses II, Ramses the Great, poured fortunes into monuments that still stand today. His statues are so enormous they dwarf those who stand in their shadow. His name carved deeply, repeated endlessly on temple walls. Behind this glorious inscription campaign, however, lies a more unsettling truth. Many monuments were not built by him, but taken over from predecessors. He erased their names and replaced them with his own, rewriting stone as if rewriting history. And though he outlived most of his children and ruled for over 60 years, all the gold, all the glory, could not prevent him from death. His hopes for eternal peace were undone when tomb robbers ransacked his burial. His remains eventually hidden in a secret cache of mummies far from the grandeur he had planned. So much effort, so much treasure, and still his eternity was reduced to a battered corpse carried from one secret chamber to another. And yet, the curiosity of later generations restored him. When archaeologists unwrapped his mummy and displayed him before a modern world, his face, stern jaw, aquiline nose, tufts of white hair, gave him a second life in our imagination. In a strange way, the pharaoh's dream of immortality was realized, though not as he envisioned. Instead of ruling the stars, he lingers as a relic on display, gazed upon by crowds who whisper his name thousands of years after his body failed. The same fate awaited countless others. Tutankhamun, whose reign was unremarkable in life, became legendary only because tomb robbers never found his burial chamber until modern times. His painted shrines, golden mask, and glittering treasures ignited Tutmania around the globe, transforming a fragile boy king into the most famous pharaoh ever known. One wonders what he himself might have thought, limping through his short life with pain in his bones, burdened with divine titles he lacked the strength to carry. In death, his legacy was greater than he could have dreamed, not for his deeds, but because his treasures survived. Eternity, it seems, is often a matter of chance. By the late dynasties, Egypt fell under foreign hands. Persians, Assyrians, and Libyans each took their turn to command the Nile. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great marched into the land and claimed the crown of the pharaohs. After his death, his general Ptolemy took Egypt for himself and founded a new dynasty that combined Greek and Egyptian traditions. They wore Egyptian crowns, performed Egyptian rituals, and even married siblings in the old style to preserve divinity. But their names, Ptolemy, Berenice, Cleopatra, betrayed their Greek roots. At last, under Cleopatra VII, the final queen of the Nile, the long line of pharaohs reached its end. When she took her own life in 30 BCE, Egypt bowed under Roman control, and the reign of god-kings was finished. Yet even here, the peculiar contradictions of pharaonic life are clear. Cleopatra remains one of the most iconic figures in history, known less for the temples she raised than for the legends that followed her. Intellect, beauty, cunning, romance, power. The pharaohs, it seems, were never remembered solely for their rituals or monuments, but for the myths they created by simply existing as gods who were also people. Myths that outlasted their empire. And that is the disturbing brilliance of the pharaohs. They believed immortality meant constructing eternal tombs, ruling absolute, ensuring their name was never erased. They went to extremes that cost lives, drained resources, and warped families. Yet what sustains their memory today is not simply stone or treasure, but the obsession itself, the audacity of mortals who dared consider themselves gods and acted accordingly. And in their audacity, they left behind a fascination that has lasted across millennia. The paradox that defined the pharaohs remains. They ruled as gods, yet trembled at the whims of priests, generals, and family. They commanded unmeasurable riches, yet broke under the same frailties, disease, betrayal, aging, that govern us all. They built pyramids to last forever, but most of their monuments lie ruined or scattered, looted of their treasures. They demanded loyalty in life and servitude in death, but their courts were nests of conspiracy. They sought eternal perfection, yet their lineage is littered with deformities, insecurity, and decline. And still, perhaps they succeeded. For thousands of years after they drew their last breaths, we still speak their names in awed tones. Khufu, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Tutankhamun, Ramses, Cleopatra. Each name summons images every culture on Earth recognizes. The pyramids, the Sphinx, gold masks, eyes painted with coal, gods with animal heads. The pharaohs feared being forgotten, and in this perhaps they triumphed. Their world is gone, their temples hollow shells, but their legacy lives, not in eternity as they imagined, but in the restless curiosity that drives us to look back at them again and again. And so, as our long wandering through their lives draws to a close, we leave the pharaohs where they always wanted to rest, in eternity. But we carry with us a clearer picture, not simply of dazzling crowns and golden masks, but of lives spent under staggering pressure, distorted by superstition, glittering with power, but shadowed by paranoia and death. They remind us that even the highest throne is built on shifting sand. And even gods on earth cannot escape being human. Now, as the echoes of their story fade into the hush of the desert night, let the sands of ancient Egypt cover them once more, their faces blurred, but their names still alive on our tongues. May the stillness of the Nile whisper them to sleep, and may we, in listening to their tale, drift quietly into our own. The god-kings are gone, the temples stand in ruin, but the dream of eternity lingers, haunting, magnificent, and disturbingly human. Good night.